The story behind a quilt.
Every piece of fiber art has a story. If you think back to making your donation items, we all agreed that we didn't want them to be simply thrown away. We wanted our hard work to be put to good use, for someone to cherish it, potentially for years to come. One form of fiber art that shows the stories behind it well is quilting. It would be impossible for us to tell you the story behind every quilt ever made, or even every type of quilt. But here are a few stories that stood out to us, as well as some stories of our own. The word quilt comes from the Latin quiltita, meaning stuffed sack or cushion. The earliest evidence of quilting is a 3400 BC carved ivory figure of an Egyptian pharaoh wearing what looks like a quilted mantle. Quilted clothing and bedding were primarily luxury goods for the wealthy only. They are mentioned in 13th century French and Dutch accounts. By the 15th century, inventories of some wealthy English households mention specific quilts in great detail. Although quilting techniques must have been well known to the early colonists, references to American quilts do not appear until the late 17th century. It wasn't until the 1800s that quilts were made and owned by Americans of all classes. Quilts reached their highest expression as folk art during the 19th century. Gee's Bend is a small community near Selma, Alabama. The area got its name from Joseph Gee, a plantation owner who owned most of the surrounding land in the 1800s. The town's women had a distinct quilting style based on traditional American quilts. They have a geometric simplicity reminiscent of Amish quilts and modern art. The women of Gee's Bend passed their skills and aesthetics down through at least 6 generations onto the present. In 2002, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston presented an exhibition of 70 quilt masterpieces from the Bend. The display was entitled The Quilt of Gee's Bend, and it received international acclaim and traveled to over 12 cities around the world. Hundreds of print and broadcast media organizations have celebrated the quilts in the history of this unique town. Art critics worldwide have compared the quilts to the works of important artists such as Henri Matisse and Paul Klee. The New York Times called the quilts some of the most miraculous works of modern art America has ever produced. In 2003, with assistance from Tin Wood Organization, all of the quilters of Gee's Bend, more than 50 women, founded the Gee's Bend Quilters Collective to serve as an exclusive means of selling and marketing their quilts. The collective is owned and operated by the women of Gee's Bend, and every quilt is sold by the Gee's Bend Quilt Collective is unique, produced individually and authentic. Each quilt is signed by the quilter and labeled with a serial number. Each quilt has a unique story that the collective ensures is carried out for generations.
Gee's Bend isn't the only place quilts were booming in the 1800s. In 1865, the Civil War ended. In the years since, orally transmitted information, such as secret codes, camouflage symbols, and hidden signposts that were part of the Underground Railroad experience have been revealed. Many of these oral stories have included stories of escaping slaves who traveled on foot in unfamiliar lands, recognizing strangers' homes as places of sanction by means of prearranged signals. Quilts were used throughout the Underground Railroad as a symbolic piece that contained secret encoded messages. One of the most ionic pattern patchwork quilts from this period is often known as the Jacob's Ladder pattern, recently renamed the Underground Railroad pattern. This style quilt would have hung outside of the home of the Underground Railroad supporters to signal the slaves to let them know they had reached a safe haven. However, many historians have discredited this quilt. Scholars claim that this quilt design had not yet been invented, so it could not have contained the secret messages that the runaway slaves would have recognized on the Underground Railroad. Many of the Underground Railroad's signal to slaves tales were all transmitted orally and lacked validation in written documentation. In other words, these stories lack credibility. John Blassingame, author of Slave Testimony, challenged the historians who discredited or rejected the truth of black slaves' stories because they were oral testimonies. It has since been proven that many oral stories from the Underground Railroad are in fact true, and quilts were capable of justifying this. In the African American community, the quilt code is one of the most well-known oral traditions. Handed down orally by generations, the Underground Railroad quilt code is a mystery-laden, secret communication system of employing quilt-making terminology as a message map for black slaves escaping on the Underground Railroad, Benberry. Jacqueline Tobin and Raymond Dobard deciphered the quilt code, which had explicit and implicit ramifications. They learned what the phrases and words of the code meant to the slaves who used it almost 170 years ago. Through this extensive research, Tobin and Dobard were able to establish a significant linkage between the Underground Railroad effort, escaping slaves, and the famous American patchwork quilt. The Underground Railroad quilt code has significant meaning. There are 5 square knots on the quilt every 2 inches apart. They escaped on the 5th knot on the 10th pattern and went to Ontario, Canada. The monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada on a bear's paw trail to the crossroads. Once they got to the crossroads, they dug a log cabin on the ground. Shufuli told them to dress up in cotton and satin bow ties and go to the cathedral church, get married, and exchange double wedding rings. Flying geese stay on the drunkard's path and follow the stars. At first reading, one is struck by the imagery and poetic descriptions, but beneath the language lies a much deeper, much larger story. A story that reaches back to Africa and forward to the Carolinas, connecting African symbols to familiar quilt patterns, all tied together with the sounds of spirituals and the African American struggle to escape the bonds of slavery. While looking for quilting stories, we interviewed a few quilters here in Macon. Our first interview was with Sharon Funderburk, who lives in Byron, Georgia. We compiled a short list of 4 questions to ask her, and here's how it went. We started out the interview by asking her, "What does quilting mean to you?" Her response:
In one word, relaxation. For many years, I had a plant nursery in the backyard, and I would be out there most of the day working. It was wonderful to be able to come in from the heat and sit down and do hand work on the quilts and feel like I was accomplishing something. My sewing area was in the corner of the living room, so I could spend most of the time with my husband and children while still working on different projects. It was a great way to decompress at the end of the day. Quilting is also about history to me. This was a task that was women's work and how she was able to provide and take care of her family. My mother has memories of sitting under the quilting hoop with her mother and aunts while working. It's very important to me to carry on the tradition and the history.
We found Sharon's response to be very fitting to many of our readings we had in class as well. Barbara mentioned many times about women's work, and that's exactly how Sharon saw it as well. Our second question that we asked was, "How did you get into quilting?" Her response:
While in college, I came across a quilt top that my grandmother had made. She worked on it in a mental institution in World War II and made the clothing for the patients there. She was able to keep the fabric scraps that were left over and had put together a quilt top for herself. She never finished quilting it at some point and had given it to my mother, who stored it away in a trunk. When I came across it, my mother said I could have it on one condition: I had to finish the quilt. I ended up buying the backing fabric for it while visiting my brother in New York. I was actually still working on it when I met my husband in the early 80s. I had no idea what I was doing, so I started working on it, and my mother wasn't living close enough to teach me, so I had to teach myself. After I finished it, I showed her, and she kept pointing out all the places where knots were showing and asked why the thread was doubled. I'm happy to say my technique has improved very much over time.
Sharon's response to this question hits close to home for many of us. Several of us had never picked up a pair of knitting needles before the start of this course, but look how far many of us have come. As a class, we may have not learned much about quilting, but think about the feeling of accomplishment when you finish a project. The adrenaline rush and the eager you get to show off your own creation, that's how people feel with quilting too. With quilts, people can tell their own story. They can set up each square to have a meaning, and any individual that sees it can read the story and visualize the time and energy it took to create such a masterpiece. We continued our interview with our third question. What is one of your favorite quilts that you have made, and what is the story behind it? Sharon's response was,
I think my favorite quilt has to be the one I made for my parents for their 50th wedding anniversary. I did a double wedding ring quilt, and inside the different rings are embroidered the names and the birthdays of the members of the family who were married at that time. At that point, all my siblings were spread out across the country, so I mailed them the fabric so that they could embroider their own names themselves. The youngest of my siblings, Robert, got married on my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, so everyone was in town for the wedding. They got married in the afternoon, so we had a huge party to celebrate my parents that night. The night before the wedding, Robert's bride took the quilt into one of her upstairs bedroom, and I taught her how to embroider so that she added her name to the quilt before I gave it to them. There are many names that need to be added to the quilt since our family has grown very much since then. Hopefully sometime soon I will find time to sit down and do that.
Sharon's favorite quilt that she had made has a lot of meaning behind it. She created a piece that would be passed down through generations. Many of her grandchildren were obviously not born yet to attend her parents' 50th wedding anniversary, but this quilt can help tell the story of this party and the 50 years that her parents spent together. A quilt is more than just a blanket. It's like a window into someone's life. Quilts can be read many different ways, but no matter what way you read them, they always tell a story. Our last and final question that we asked Sharon was if there is anything else that you would like to share about quilting with us. Her response,
quilting is such a wonderful way to pass on a family's history from one generation to the next. It hurts me to go to yard sales and see grandma's quilts for sale rather than being passed down to grandchildren. We have a couple quilts here at the house that belong to a couple of my aunts. They inherited them from their uncle who was a pastor. One of the quilts was a retirement present for him from his church when he retired. The church members had all signed different squares of the quilt, and you can make out several signatures even after years of fading. We were contacted for a quilt documentation project that the state was doing a few years back. I submitted a few quilts for it and were able to go to the exhibit they had in Atlanta. I still remember one of the quilts we saw on display that had been handed down through one family since before the Civil War. It was shown that there were blood stains on it from where there was a sick bed from an injured soldier. To be able to pass down history like that and remember the stories of why quilts were made or what they had been through is incredibly important to me.
Sharon is right. Quilting is important, like any form of fiber arts. We, as a class, have learned how important it is to keep the fiber arts alive today. Quilting hasn't died off yet, but it's come close. Many people are intimidated by quilting, but they don't realize how easy it can actually be. How cool would it be to be able to create your own story into a quilt, and 100 years from now, your grandchildren have it and can relive some of your life through it. Your grandchildren who have never met you can have a piece of your life right there in their lap. So we leave you with this question. What is the story behind your quilt?